don't want to begin on a negative note, but I did look up George Orwell on Wikipedia a couple of days ago, and I discovered the most extraordinary error, which I'd like to correct immediately. It said he was the second greatest writer in the 20th century in Britain. It's absolute nonsense. He was easily the greatest writer. And furthermore, the reason why we don't have a decent book, a decent interpretation on the most dangerous moment in British history is that he died tragically early. He died in 1946, 1950, at the age of 46. Absolutely the peak of his powers. And there was nobody left, including the charlatan, not a charlatan, the person who was wrongly identified as Britain's greatest writer, who could deal with it. So just as Orwell was the only person who could really deal with the new forms of authoritarianism which had occurred in the 20th century, he was the only person who could deal with this. And his disappearance produced a huge gap in British history, which has not yet been filled. And so I'm simply going to point out, I think, some of the things that as soon as anybody who can, because he was so good, I think it's probably put other people off. But here's one of the things that he would have noticed, and nobody else would have noticed. I mean, the biggest gap in the entire history of international relations in the 20th century is how it affected children. I mean, there will be an opportunity afterwards. If anybody can think of any great scholar who noticed what children were up to, other than, of course, George Orwell in 1984, where he talks about, amongst other things, the children going around the beds of those who are subject to euthanasia. He would have noticed this. Not a single British or American historian has noticed an experience which I don't think there is any comparison in the history of childhood in world history. So this is the reason why anybody in the United States, aged between early 50s and early 60s, remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis, because they were all taught, like the children in this photograph, during the Missile Crisis, to hide under their desks and adopt the brace position. You would have thought that that was something which was so central to the history of the human race that it would have appeared in every history of the 20th century, but no, it hasn't. Now, what was it like? Well, I mean, I've been fortunate that quite a number of people who were involved in this kind of experience have shared it with me, and this is just one example. This is a child who was living in Buffalo, New York, at the time of the missile crisis, 13. We discussed what to do in the case of a nuclear attack. The school had to drill the day before. We were told to hide under our desks and cover our heads in case of a nuclear attack. How is it possible to write a history of the United States which doesn't mention that? Well, it is possible because no history of the United States mentions that. So what does he say? The only reason I quote it is because it's typical of all the other memories that we're giving. We were terrified. I remember sitting on the big yellow school bus on the trip to school that morning thinking, will I get home today? Am I going to die? Is this it? Just looking out the window at the world passing by and wondering. If George Orwell had been alive, nobody would have been able to forget that kind of experience. Because he died 10 years too soon, 12 years too soon, hardly anybody remembers it. So, who did notice it? Well, this is particularly addressed to those in the audience who are over in late 40s up to even older than I am. If your children were worried 50 years ago, and indeed more recently than that, what did you do? You would pick up on either side of the Atlantic the best-selling book in British and American history, with the single exception of the Bible. But people actually read Dr. Benjamin's book in times of crisis, whereas regrettably few others did. So, here's the book, published in 1945. Those of the front can read the small print. Translated into 39 languages, sells more than 40 billion copies. But you can see that Dr. Benjamin Spock has a political affiliation, which is, there are two options. One is that the baby put the CND. The other is that that he did. Oops, press the wrong one. Got it right this time. And what was his message? Now, because we live in such an ethnocentric society, we believe that "don't panic" was invented by Clive Dunn as Corporal, whatever it was, in the wonderful series Dad's Army, which appears every Saturday evening because the BBC can't do anything that's interesting nowadays. But actually, the phrase "don't panic" was invented by Dr. Benjamin Spock, taken over without any kind of attribution by Dad's Army, and I'm glad to be able to put that right. Well, you know, don't panic. It's all very well telling children not to panic, but they've only got to look at the magazines that are coming through the door. So, at the very moment when Dr. Spock was saying, "don't panic," what their parents were doing was leaving around, and the Time magazine is not a particularly extremist organisation. There is Khrushchev with the fires of hell behind him. Now, why did we get it? Well, partly because we, being British, have always been far more interested in spy fiction than the real work of intelligence. So, last month, October 1962, there were two anniversaries. One that really mattered, is the most dangerous moment in the history of British history and American history and a few other countries as well. But actually, what people remember are the Bond films. The first Bond film was produced actually in the middle of the missile crisis, and that's what people remember. And John F. Kennedy, who was, as we saw in the first image which I showed, was struggling to deal with the most dangerous crisis in the history of the world. He was responsible for turning Bond into the extraordinary icon that he's since become. Extraordinary icon. I mean, there will be questions and discussions afterwards. But I will be surprised if anybody in the audience can think of anybody or anything who has been the brand leader for 50 years. Now, Bond was not the brand leader until Kennedy took him over. Even Pepsi, even Coca-Cola has had more trouble with Pepsi than Bond has had with absurd Hollywood wannabes like Bourne and so on. So, intelligence is the only profession in the history of the world in which a fictional character is many, many times better known than anyone who really worked for it. That is why the British memory of the real importance of intelligence has been overlaid by images like this. The New York Times said on the day after the opening of the Olympic Games, only a culture with a profound superiority complex would have opened the Olympic Games like this. And it's true. I mean, we didn't suppose that the foreigners would laugh at us. We simply supposed that when the Queen parachuted into they would just think of how superior our culture was. They could possibly imagine. And they were, of course, absolutely right. So now back to what actually was going on in 1962. Well, just to remind you, the horrid stuff that is going on nowadays is at the opposite end of Cuba. You can see quite Padron Bay. Those sites which show missiles are in fact those sites which had missiles. And notice how close they are to the United States. The nearest missile site is only 90 miles from Florida Keys. And the United States was not used to that. And what was only 90 miles from Florida Keys? Well, the Soviet intermediate range ballistic missile, the first to be deployed with thermonuclear warheads. So it was quite a nasty shock suddenly to discover that they were quite as close as they were. And we won't dwell on this, but this shows where the medium range ballistic missiles could have reached, and as you'll see, it includes Washington, which was a wholly novel experience in the history of the United States. Now, what happens nowadays is that regime change of a kind that none of us expect happens so quickly it takes us by surprise. So the Arab Spring. I mean, 2 years ago the Arab Spring hadn't even begun. And when Cuba gets rid of the horrid Batistas, it again produces form of regime change that nobody, not the Kremlin, not Washington, not us, not Cuban specialists, not anybody was predicting. So there we are, the best looking leader in modern world history, Fidel Castro. Look at him now. It just shows that if you're a dictator for 50 years, it affects your appearance as well as anything else. The idea in the Kremlin or in the White House, this man would be the leader 2 years later of a Communist one-party state, absolutely beyond imagination, just as it is beyond all our imagination that the Arab Spring would change things.